In 1324, a king left his home and accidentally shook the gold markets of the medieval Mediterranean. He crossed the Sahara Desert with thousands of followers and so much gold that the markets of Cairo felt the economic shock for more than a decade. Merchants who had built their livelihoods on the stable price of gold watched everything they owned lose its value. Not because of war, not because of famine, but because one man had simply passed through their city on his way to pray. His name was Mansa Musa. He ruled the Mali Empire, and he is widely considered by many historians and economists to be one of the wealthiest individuals who ever lived. You probably were not taught his name in school. This documentary is about why. Because the story of the Mali Empire is not just a story about gold. It is a story about how civilizations are remembered and how they are forgotten. It is a story about a university city in the Saharan savannah that housed more scholars than most European capitals of its time. It is a story about manuscripts hidden in desert sand to keep them alive across 5 centuries of danger. And it is a story about a question that every honest reader of history eventually has to ask. Who decides which empires get remembered? Chapter 1. The World Before Mali. Begin with a map, not the map you were shown in school, where the continents sit in familiar proportion and the labels cluster around Europe and the Mediterranean and the ancient river valleys of the Middle East. Begin instead with a map drawn from the perspective of a trans-Saharan camel caravan in the year 1200, moving south through the desert with a load of salt and a destination somewhere in the fertile savanna beyond the horizon. From that perspective, the world looks completely different. The Sahara is not a barrier. It is a highway. The cities of North Africa are not the edge of the known world. They are waypoints on a commercial network stretching south into a region of extraordinary wealth, governed by sophisticated states that have been trading with the Arab world for centuries. The empty space at the bottom of the European map is, from this perspective, the center of everything that matters commercially. That reorientation is where the Mali Empire begins. Because Mali did not emerge from nowhere, it emerged from a world already dense with political organization, commercial sophistication, and cultural achievement that the standard Western curriculum has consistently failed to teach. Understanding what that world looked like before Mali rose to dominate it is the only honest way to understand why Mali became what it became. The geography of West Africa is the foundation of everything that followed. The region sits at the intersection of 2 radically different ecological zones. To the north lies the Sahara, the largest hot desert in the world. To the south lie the forests and rivers of the Guinea coast, wet and dense and rich with resources. Between these 2 zones runs a band of savanna called the Sahel, a word derived from the Arabic for shore, as if the desert itself were an ocean and the grasslands were its coastline. That coastline is where the Mali Empire would eventually be built. And the reason comes down to 2 commodities that each zone had in abundance and that the other could not live without: gold and salt. The forests and river valleys of the south sat on some of the richest gold deposits in the medieval world. The fields of Bambouk and Bouré, located in what is now western Mali and eastern Senegal, produced gold in quantities that would have seemed almost mythological to any outside observer. But the people living near those fields had a critical problem. They had almost no access to salt, a mineral so essential to human survival that armies have been paid in it and wars have been fought over it throughout recorded history. The Sahara had the opposite problem. Beneath the desert floor, in places like Tahaza, in what is now northern Mali, lay deposits of rock salt so vast and so pure that the mines there produced slabs used as building material. Entire structures were constructed from salt blocks. But the people of the desert had no gold. The trans-Saharan trade route existed to close that gap. Caravans of camels moved back and forth across the Sahara, carrying gold north and salt south. The men who controlled the points where those caravans crossed, where the desert met the savanna, where the gold met the salt, accumulated wealth on a scale that most of their contemporaries could barely imagine. That accumulation was not luck. It was the product of deliberate political design, sustained over generations by rulers who understood that controlling the intersection of supply and demand was more profitable than controlling either supply or demand alone. This trading system was not new when Mali emerged. It had been operating for centuries, and it had already produced one remarkable empire before Mali was ever founded: the Ghana Empire, which occupied territory north of the modern nation that now carries its name, dominated West African trade from roughly the 4th century through the 11th century of the Common Era. Ghana was not itself a gold-producing state. Its genius was control. The Ghana kings positioned their capital at the precise point where gold from the south met the trans-Saharan caravans from the north, and they taxed every transaction in both directions. Gold coming up from the south was taxed. Salt coming down from the north was taxed. The king maintained a monopoly on all gold nuggets while allowing private traders to deal in gold dust. This single policy kept the price of gold high enough to make the kingdom wealthy and low enough to keep the traders coming back. The Arab geographer al-Bakri, writing in 1068, described the court of the Ghana king with the unmistakable texture of genuine astonishment. He described a domed pavilion surrounded by horses draped in gold cloth, attendants carrying gold shields and swords, and the sons of vassal kings with gold braided into their hair. The ceremony he documented was not the ceremony of a simple chieftainship. It was the ceremony of a mature and confident state, consciously performing its own authority for an audience that needed to be impressed. Al-Bakri was a scholar working in Cordoba with access to accounts from Arab merchants and travelers who had direct experience of the trans-Saharan trade. His description was not imagination. It was reportage, filtered through the conventions of medieval Arabic geographical literature, but grounded in real commercial and diplomatic contact between the Islamic world and West Africa, stretching back centuries before he wrote. This is the point that the standard Western curriculum consistently fails to communicate clearly. West Africa was not isolated from the medieval world. It was one of the medieval world's significant commercial participants. The gold that helped supply the gold economy of the Abbasid world, that flowed into the coins of medieval Islamic civilization, that eventually reached European markets and helped finance cathedral building projects and military campaigns. A meaningful share of that gold came from the forests and rivers of West Africa. The precise proportion is debated among economic historians and should not be stated as a settled figure. But the direction of the evidence is not disputed among scholars who have examined it seriously. West Africa was a significant supplier of gold to the Old World economy across the entire medieval period, and the states that organized and taxed that supply were among the wealthiest political entities of their era. By the 12th century, the Ghana Empire was in serious decline. The reasons were interconnected in the way that imperial declines usually are. Climate data reconstructed from lake sediment records suggests a period of extended drought in the region around 1060 to 1070 that damaged the agricultural base supporting the empire's population. The Almoravid movement, a reformist Islamic force from North Africa, applied sustained military pressure on Ghana's northern territories, Internal rebellions among subject peoples fractured the empire's authority at its edges. The gold trade did not stop, but the political structure that had organized and taxed it was breaking apart. Into the space that Ghana's decline created, several competing successor states emerged. The Sasso Kingdom, led by a ruler named Sumanguru Kante, briefly dominated the region in the early 13th century. Sumanguru's reputation in the oral traditions of West Africa is that of a warrior of extraordinary power, a blacksmith king whose authority over iron gave him a near mythological status in a world where iron weapons and tools were transformative technologies. But power built on military dominance alone has a structural weakness that commercially organized states do not. Military dominance requires constant violence to maintain. The moment the dominant force is removed, everything it held together by fear begins to separate. The people who would build the next great empire in West Africa understood this distinction, and the political system they designed reflected that understanding in ways that would shape the Western Sudan for 2 centuries. They were a group called the Mandinka, part of the broader Mande-speaking cultural family that stretches across West Africa to this day. They had lived within Ghana's sphere of influence, absorbed the commercial logic of the trans-Saharan trade, and were watching from the edges of Sumanguru's kingdom for the moment when the balance of power might shift. That moment was approaching, and it would arrive not through a general born to command, but through a child that almost no one in the region expected to matter. Chapter 2. Sundiata, the Lion King who was real. Picture a royal household in the early 13th century. Not the romanticized version, the daily reality. A king with multiple wives, each with her own children and her own ambitions and her own network of allies within the court. A woman named Sogolan, brought to the king after a hunter's prophecy, declared that a great son would come from her. A first wife named Sasuma, watching the new arrival with the specific attention of someone who understands that prophecy is politics. When Sogolan's child was born, he was given the name Sundiata, and for the first years of his life, he was a problem that his mother's enemies found deeply convenient. He could not walk, while other children moved freely through the village. Sundiata crawled. Sasuma made sure the court knew it. She used the boy's condition as a weapon against his mother in the daily contest of a royal household where influence was everything and vulnerability was currency. Then one day, according to the tradition preserved across generations by the griots, the professional oral historians who carried West African history in their memories, Sundiata asked for an iron rod. He planted it in the ground. He wrapped his hands around it, and he stood. This documentary will not ask you to treat that image as literal documentary fact. The griots preserved truth the way Homer preserved truth about the Trojan War, inside a structure shaped by centuries of retelling into the form most useful for teaching a people who they are and where they came from. The details of the story shifted across generations and across the many different communities that told it. The outline did not. What the historical and archaeological record supports is this. Sundiata Keita was a real person. He founded what would become the Mali Empire in approximately 1235. He defeated Sumanguru Kante at a battle near Kirina, a victory corroborated not only by griot tradition, but by multiple Arabic chronicles and by the oral accounts of several different ethnic groups who were present in the region at the time. These are not legends dressed as history. They are events with multiple independent witnesses, filtered through different traditions that agree on the essentials while differing on details in exactly the way that genuine historical events tend to differ across independent accounts. What the griot tradition preserves that the written sources sometimes miss is the political texture of how Sundiata actually built his power. And that texture is where the story becomes genuinely instructive. Start with the exile, because the exile is where Sundiata's real education happened. When Sundiata's father died, the political situation in Kangaba became dangerous for Sogalan and her children. Sasuma and her allies moved to consolidate power around her own son. Sogalan took Sundiata and his siblings and left, beginning years of wandering through the courts of neighboring kingdoms. She sought refuge and found it sometimes generously and sometimes barely at all. At the courts of rulers themselves, navigating the shifting landscape of a region where Sumanguru's power was expanding and the cost of backing the wrong future ruler was very real. This exile did something that comfortable succession at home could never have done. It educated Sundiata in the political geography of the entire region. He saw how different courts operated. He understood which rulers were genuinely strong and which were performing strength they did not actually possess. He built relationships across multiple kingdoms that a prince raised at home in certainty would never have accumulated. By the time conditions allowed him to return and challenge for power, he possessed something more valuable than an army. He possessed a detailed, earned understanding of the world he intended to lead. The coalition he assembled before the battle near Kirina was the product of that understanding, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives. Sundiata did not simply raise an army. He constructed a network of alliances among precisely the peoples that Sumanguru had conquered or threatened, offering each group something specific that Soso rule had denied them. The Mandinka clans, whose commercial networks Sumanguru had disrupted, the neighboring peoples who had endured Soso raids, the traders whose trans-Saharan routes had become less predictable under a military regime that valued tribute over commerce. Each alliance was a transaction, not a declaration of loyalty. And transactions, properly structured, are more durable than declarations. Sumanguru's response to this coalition revealed the limitation of his theory of power. He had built his authority on the assumption that military dominance was self-sustaining, that people would continue to accept his rule because resisting it was too costly. What he had not calculated was what happens when enough people decide that the cost of accepting the rule exceeds the cost of resisting it. Sundiata's coalition had changed that calculation for enough people to matter. The battle near Kirina, fought in approximately 1235, was not simply a military engagement between two armies. It was the collision of two theories of how power works. Sumanguru's theory was force applied consistently enough to make resistance unthinkable. Sundiata's theory was interest aligned carefully enough to make resistance unnecessary. When Saso power broke at Kirina, it broke completely. Because a state held together by a single man's military dominance has no structural resilience once that man is gone. Sumanguru disappeared after the battle. The world he had held together by force came apart without him. What Sundiata built in its place was structurally different in a way that proved enormously consequential. What might loosely be described in modern terms as a federation. The Mali Empire was a network of relationships between the Mandinka center and the various peoples and kingdoms that had joined Sundiata's alliance, each retaining significant local autonomy in exchange for tribute obligations and military participation when the empire required it. Local rulers kept their positions. Local customs and institutions were largely preserved. The Mandinka elite at the center governed through relationship management as much as through administrative control. This structure had a direct commercial logic. The trans-Saharan trade that had made Ghana wealthy depended on a network of merchants, guilds, and local intermediaries spread across an enormous geographic area. A centralized state attempting to control every node in that network through direct administration would have collapsed under its own overhead costs. A structure that gave local leaders a genuine stake in maintaining commercial peace kept the network functioning at the scale that generated the revenues Mali would become famous for. Sundiata did not live to see the full flowering of what he had planted. He died sometime in the 1250s. With the available sources differing on the precise year and circumstances in ways that honest historical accounting should acknowledge rather than paper over. What he left behind was a tradition whose memory would outlast him by 8 centuries and counting. A political framework capable of expansion. A cultural identity built around the Mandinka language and traditions that could absorb other peoples without erasing their distinctiveness. And a commercial orientation toward the gold and salt trade that had enriched the region for centuries. His successors would spend the next 100 years expanding that framework in every direction. The commercial machinery that made all of that possible is where we go next. Chapter 3. How an Empire is Built from Sand and Gold. Step into the shoes of a salt merchant in the year 1300. You have made the crossing from Tagaza to the Niger Bend 14 times in your working life. You know the desert, the way most people know their own neighborhood, the landmarks that matter and the ones that mislead, the water sources that can be trusted and the ones that have failed before, the specific quality of light in the hour before dawn that tells you the temperature of the day ahead. You have moved hundreds of tons of salt south and returned north, with gold dust packed in goatskin pouches sewn into the lining of your robes. You do not think of yourself as part of an economic system. You think of yourself as a man doing a job his father taught him, who learned it from his father before that. But the system you are part of has been, for the past century, one of the most significant commercial networks in the known world. And the empire that controls the routes you travel has become something that the wider world is only beginning to understand the full scale of. The foundation of that empire is the exchange you carry on your back. The gold fields of Bambouk and Bure produced gold through alluvial extraction, meaning gold that had washed down from ancient geological formations and settled in river sediments and soil layers accessible with basic tools. The people who actually worked those fields were not Mandinka. They were local communities with their own traditions, their own relationship to the land, and their own understanding of what the gold in the ground was worth. Here is the stroke of strategic intelligence that made Mali's commercial system work. The Mali rulers did not attempt to control the extraction process directly. They controlled the trade in gold instead. Direct control of mining requires permanent administrative and military presence in the mining regions. It generates resentment. It is expensive. It creates constant opportunities for the people doing the actual work to hide what they find. The system that Mali inherited and deliberately refined worked on a different logic entirely. The gold producers maintained their autonomy. They extracted on their own schedule and their own terms. But they could only sell into trade networks that the Mali commercial system controlled. Because Mali controlled the routes those networks required to reach the markets of North Africa and the Arab world. The result was a commercial position achieved not through force, but through geography and relationship. Considerably more stable and less expensive than a monopoly enforced at the point of a spear. Watch what happens when your caravan reaches the market at the Niger Bend. You unload your salt. A Mali official with a set of bronze weights approaches your counterpart, the gold merchant who has traveled north from the forest zone. The weights are standard across the empire. The same in this market as in the market 300 miles to the west, the same as the ones used in transactions last month and last year and the year before that. The official checks the scale. The transaction proceeds. Both parties know exactly what they agreed to. And both parties know that if a dispute arises, there is a court that will hear it. That standardization was not automatic. It required officials who checked the scales consistently and punished fraud reliably. It required a state with enough institutional reach to make that enforcement credible in markets spread across a territory larger than Western Europe. It required a functioning government with professional administrators who understood that the integrity of the weights was the integrity of the currency, and the integrity of the currency was the foundation on which the entire commercial network rested. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan traveler, whose account of his journey through Mali in 1352 remains one of the most detailed primary sources we have for this period, described the security of commercial travel through the empire's territory with an emphasis that reflects genuine comparative judgment. He had traveled from Morocco to East Africa to India to China before arriving in Mali. When he noted that a merchant could move with valuables through Mali without reasonable fear of robbery, he was comparing that experience to what he had observed across most of the medieval world. The comparison favored Mali. That security was policy, not coincidence. An empire whose revenues flow from the volume of trade moving through its territory has a direct financial interest in ensuring that trade continues to move. Every merchant, deterred by insecurity, was tribute not collected, commercial tax not received. A transaction in which Mali had invested in roads and ferries and rest stations and received nothing in return. The investment in maintaining order was an investment with a measurable return. And the Mali rulers understood the calculation with the clarity of people whose wealth depended on getting it right. The tax structure generating Mali's revenues applied at multiple levels of the commercial system. Goods crossing into the empire paid duty at border checkpoints. Gold changing hands in the major markets paid a transaction levy. The specific rates varied across the empire's history and geography in ways that the available sources do not always allow precise reconstruction. But the underlying logic was consistent. Mali's wealth came not primarily from producing gold or salt directly, but from being positioned between the two and collecting a share of every exchange. By the early 14th century, this system had been operating and expanding for roughly a century since Sundiata's founding. The revenues it generated had allowed Mali's rulers to build cities, fund armies, attract scholars, and construct the kind of institutional depth that separates durable empires from impressive but temporary concentrations of military force. The empire that Mansa Musa inherited when he came to the throne in approximately 1312 was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most commercially sophisticated and financially significant political entities in the world at that moment. Some historians have estimated that West Africa was a significant contributor of gold to the Old World economy during this period, though the precise proportions involved remain debated in the scholarly literature and should be understood as informed estimates rather than settled figures. What is not debated is that when Musa decided to make his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he had access to resources on a scale that the outside world had not yet fully reckoned with. Back to our salt merchant at the Niger Bend market. The transaction is complete. The official records the exchange in a painted ledger. Your caravan loads the gold and prepares to move north toward the Saharan routes. Somewhere south of here, in the capital of the empire, whose roads you travel, a king is making preparations that will take the rest of the year to complete. You will be long gone before his caravan departs, but the consequences of that journey will reach the markets you sell in. in ways you cannot yet imagine. Chapter 4. Timbuktu, the city the world forgot. Walk through Timbuktu in the year 1450. The first thing you notice is the sound, not the silence that the word conjures in English, not the emptiness that the name has come to suggest to people who have never looked into its history. What you hear is the sound of a city at work, merchants calling prices in Arabic and Mandinka and Tamashek, the creak of wooden wheels on the streets that connect the great market to the river port, the voice of a scholar reading aloud to students in the courtyard of the Sankor Mosque, a sound that has been continuous in this city for generations, and that carries, in its very continuity, the weight of something built to last. When English speakers want to describe somewhere impossibly remote, they reach for a specific word, Timbuktu. The word has been doing that work in English for so long that most people who use it have never paused to ask where it comes from or what it originally referred to. Children learn it as an abstraction. Adults deploy it without knowing they are using the name of a real city that was, for roughly 2 centuries, closer to the center of the medieval world's most important commercial and intellectual networks than most cities in contemporary Europe. That casual English usage, read against the actual history of the place it names, is one of the more precise measures of how thoroughly the civilization that built this city has been written out of the mainstream historical narrative. The city sits at the point where the Niger River makes its great northward bend toward the Sahara before curling back south. This bend creates a zone of seasonal flooding that deposits rich silt across a landscape that would otherwise be marginal for agriculture. The river provides water, fish, and a transportation network connecting the city to markets hundreds of miles in every direction. And the city's position at the northern edge of this fertile zone means it sits at precisely the point where river commerce from the south meets the camel caravans from the north. That intersection was the commercial foundation of Timbuktu. But commerce alone does not produce universities. What transformed a prosperous trading city into one of the medieval world's notable intellectual centers was the specific character of Islamic civilization in this period, combined with the patronage of rulers wealthy enough to act on their religious and intellectual ambitions. Islam arrived in West Africa primarily through trade rather than conquest. The merchants who moved along the trans-Saharan routes were predominantly Muslim, and they carried their faith, their literacy, and their commercial networks with them. The Malian ruling elite converted gradually across the 13th and 14th centuries, a process that combined genuine religious conviction with strategic calculation in proportions that varied by individual, and that the available sources do not always allow us to separate cleanly. Being Muslim gave Mali's rulers access to the vast commercial and diplomatic network of the Islamic world. It gave them legitimacy in the eyes of the North African and Arab merchants whose participation in the trans-Saharan trade was essential to the empire's revenues. And it connected them to a scholarly tradition that placed extraordinary value on the collection and transmission of knowledge. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 brought back with him not only religious prestige, but something with more lasting consequences. He returned with scholars, with an architect, and with books. The great mosque of Djinguereber in Timbuktu, which still stands today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, was designed by an Andalusian architect named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, whom Musa encountered in Mecca and persuaded to return to Mali with him. Al-Sahili introduced building techniques that gave Timbuktu the distinctive mud brick aesthetic that photographs of the city still show today. An architectural vocabulary simultaneously practical in a Saharan climate and visually distinctive enough to mark the city as something other than an ordinary commercial center. The Sangkor Mosque and its associated community of scholars became, over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries, one of the significant centers of Islamic learning in the world. The institution attracted students from across the Islamic world. Estimates of the student population at various points are cited as high as 25,000 in some sources. Though these figures come from accounts of varying reliability and should be understood as indicating substantial scale rather than precise counts, what is documented is that the institution attracted scholars of genuine distinction from North Africa, Egypt, and beyond, and that its graduates pursued careers across the Islamic world. The curriculum covered the full range of Islamic scholarship as understood in the 14th and 15th centuries. Theology and Islamic law were the core disciplines, but the course of study also encompassed astronomy, mathematics, history, rhetoric, and medicine, among other subjects. The scholars of Sangkori corresponded with colleagues in Cairo, in Fez, and in Baghdad. They read and commented on the same texts being studied in the great centers of Islamic learning elsewhere. They were participants in the medieval world's intellectual life, contributing to shared debates from a specific geographical and cultural vantage point that gave their contributions a character distinctly their own. The physical evidence of this intellectual tradition accumulated in the libraries of Timbuktu across the city's scholarly centuries. Hundreds of thousands of handwritten manuscripts, produced by the scholars of Timbuktu and the broader region, and collected by its great families and institutions, covered every subject in the scholarly curriculum and many beyond it. Legal treatises and Quranic commentaries, mathematical texts and astronomical tables, histories of the Saharan kingdoms, biographies of important scholars, poetry and correspondence and commercial records. Some manuscripts were elaborately decorated with geometric borders and colored inks. Others were plain, working documents, the kind a scholar produces for immediate use rather than for posterity, which makes their survival across 5 centuries all the more remarkable. The total number of these manuscripts is genuinely uncertain. Estimates in various sources range from several 100,000 to as many as 700,000. And the honest answer is that no one knows precisely how many exist because the counting process, complicated by their wide dispersal among private family collections, is still ongoing. What is not uncertain is that the collection represents one of the most significant archives of medieval Islamic scholarship anywhere in the world, and that a substantial portion of it remains untranslated and unstudied by contemporary scholars. Ibn Battuta arrived in Mali in 1352, nearly 2 decades after Mansa Musa's death, and his account gives us something no amount of later reconstruction can fully replace. A well-traveled man paying close attention to what distinguished this civilization from others he had observed. He noted a commitment to justice he found remarkable, a society where wrongdoers were not simply protected by the power of their connections in ways he had observed elsewhere. He noted the safety of commercial travel through the empire's territory in terms reflecting genuine comparative judgment. He described the discipline and ceremony of the royal court with the eye of someone who had seen court ceremonial across North Africa, the Arab world, Persia, India, and China, and who recognized in Mali's court a sophistication that surprised him. He also described something that surprised him enough to comment on specifically. The status of women in Mali society was notably different from what he had observed in the Arab world. Women moved freely in public. They engaged in commerce. They maintained social relationships with men outside their immediate families in ways that Ibn Battuta operating from the norms of 14th century North African Islamic society, found disconcerting and said so directly. His discomfort is itself historically informative. It tells us that Mali had developed social norms genuinely distinct from those of the broader Islamic world. Norms the society maintained even after adopting Islam as the religion of its ruling class. Mali did not become an Arab society relocated to West African geography. It became a West African Islamic society, synthesizing the new religious tradition with existing Mandinka social practices in ways that produce something original, something that the most widely traveled man of the 14th century recognized as requiring specific observation and specific description. That originality is the core of what Timbuktu represented, not a provincial copy of intellectual life happening elsewhere, a genuine contribution to the medieval world's intellectual culture, made from a specific place with a specific history, by people who had absorbed a global tradition and were doing something new with it. The question that Timbuktu's history eventually demands is how a city this significant came to function as a synonym for remoteness in a language spoken by hundreds of millions of people. The answer involves military invasion, the disruption of commercial networks, and a process of intellectual marginalization that we will trace in detail later in this documentary. Hold that question for a later chapter. The scholar in the Sankor courtyard is still reading. The merchant at the river port is still calling prices. The city is still at the height of what it took 2 centuries to become. And the king who helped make it this way is about to leave a mark on the medieval world that cartographers will be trying to capture for generations. Chapter 5. Mansa Musa, the man who shook the medieval world. He did not set out to change anything. That is the part of the story that viral graphics and breathless headlines about $400 billion consistently miss. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 was not a geopolitical calculation. It was not a display of power engineered to intimidate rivals or impress foreign courts. Though it accomplished both as a side effect, it was, at its foundation, a religious obligation that a devout Muslim ruler had decided to fulfill in a manner consistent with his position. The difficulty was that his position happened to be one of the most financially powerful in the medieval world, and fulfilling a religious obligation in a manner consistent with that position turned out to have consequences that spread across the Mediterranean for more than a decade. To understand what happened in 1324, hold 2 things in mind simultaneously. The Hajj was not simply a spiritual journey for the rulers of Muslim states. It was a political and diplomatic occasion, a moment for demonstrating piety and wealth simultaneously, for building networks, recruiting talent, and returning home with the enhanced prestige that completing the pilgrimage conferred. And Musa, after approximately 12 years on the throne, had resources that placed him in a category with very few historical peers. A pilgrimage conducted at the scale appropriate to his position would announce the Mali Empire's standing to the entire Islamic world. What appropriate scale actually meant, in practical terms, was something that even well-traveled observers of the medieval world were not prepared for. The accounts of Musa's pilgrimage come from multiple sources, including Egyptian court records, accounts by the Malian scholar Ibn Amir Hajib, who spoke directly with Musa in Cairo, and later compilations by the Arab historian al-Umari, who gathered testimony from Egyptian eyewitnesses in the years following the pilgrimage. These sources agree on the broad outlines, while differing on specific numbers in ways that reflect the consistent human tendency to reach for the largest available figures when describing something genuinely extraordinary. The caravan that left Mali in 1324 was enormous by any reasonable measure. Figures cited across the sources for its total size range vary widely, And the honest position is that the precise numbers are not recoverable from the available evidence with confidence. What is recoverable? Because it is corroborated by multiple independent sources, including Egyptian administrative records, is the economic consequence of the caravan's passage through Cairo. Musa did what his cultural and religious traditions called for. He was generous, extravagantly, almost compulsively generous, in the way that a ruler for whom generosity was a political language as much as a personal virtue tends to be when placed before an audience capable of appreciating the performance. He gave gold to the officials who received him. He gave gold to the poor of Cairo. His retinue spent gold in the city's markets with an enthusiasm that suggested they had genuinely never needed to think carefully about prices. Because in Mali, they had not. Al-Umar, writing roughly a decade after the event, based on accounts gathered from Egyptian sources who had witnessed it directly, described the economic consequence with a precision unusual for medieval historical writing. The value of gold in Cairo's markets fell substantially. Merchants who had positioned themselves on the assumption of stable gold prices found their calculations disrupted in ways that took years to recover from. Al-Umari's account suggests the disruption to Cairo's gold market persisted for something in the range of a decade following Musa's visit. Though the precise duration and magnitude varied across different commercial centers and is difficult to reconstruct with confidence from the available sources, this is the reality behind the viral claim that Musa crashed the global economy. What actually occurred was more geographically specific. He flooded the Cairo gold market with enough gold, distributed quickly and freely enough, that the local price dropped substantially. Since Cairo was among the most important commercial centers in the medieval world, and its gold market was connected to the broader Mediterranean commercial network, the disruption spread outward from there. But it was a significant regional disruption to a specific commodity market, not a collapse of the global economy in any modern sense. That precise qualification does not make the event less remarkable. A single man, passing through a city on his way to a religious obligation, caused lasting economic disruption to one of the world's most important commercial centers, simply by being generous with what he had. The precision of the correction matters for intellectual honesty. The underlying reality it points toward is extraordinary regardless. Musa recognized what had happened. On the return journey, he attempted to address it. He borrowed gold from Cairo merchants at high interest rates, the purpose being to remove gold from circulation rather than add to it, in an effort to stabilize the price he had disrupted. This borrowing is documented in the Egyptian sources. Whether the correction was sufficient is less clear, and the persisting disruption that Al-Umari describes suggests it was partial at best. There is something worth sitting with in that detail. One of the most powerful rulers of the medieval world, attempting to repair economic harm he had caused through the act of being himself, borrowing money from merchants in a city he had accidentally impoverished. Power at this scale is not omnipotence. The consequences of actions outrun even the most generous intentions. The diplomatic dimension of the Cairo visit deserves attention it rarely receives in popular accounts. Musa met with the Mamluk Sultan Al-Nasir Muhammad, and the encounter was conducted with the formal protocols that powerful states perform when assessing each other. Egypt was among the dominant powers of the Arab world at this moment. The meeting between its sultan and the ruler of Mali, conducted as a meeting between significant rulers rather than between a major power and a peripheral figure, is itself a statement about where Mali stood in the political geography of the medieval world. Musa continued to Mecca, completed his pilgrimage, and began the return journey. He visited Medina and Jerusalem. He met scholars and absorbed ideas. He recruited Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, whose architectural work would reshape Timbuktu. He returned to Mali with books, with talent, and with a religious prestige that no amount of military achievement could have provided. The cartographers of Europe began incorporating information about Mali into their maps. In 1375, nearly 4 decades after Musa's death, the Catalan Atlas would place him at the center of the African continent on one of the most important geographical documents of the medieval period. Seated on a golden throne, identified as the richest and most noble king in all the land, Europe saw Musa. What Europe subsequently chose to do with that vision is one of the central threads this documentary will follow to its end. For now, the caravan is returning home. The merchants of Cairo are watching the gold price and wondering how long the recovery will take. In Timbuktu, scholars are preparing to receive the new ideas and new people that their king is bringing back from the center of the Islamic world. Something is being built, and it will last, in one form or another, for centuries. Chapter 6. The Map That Changed Europe. In 1375, on the island of Majorca, off the coast of what is now Spain, a cartographer named Abraham Cresques completed a document that many historians of geography consider among the most significant of the medieval period. The Catalan Atlas was produced on 6 panels of parchment mounted on wooden boards, painted with careful detail and colored inks. With gold leaf applied to figures and regions of particular importance, it depicted the known world from the Atlantic coast in the west to the territories of China in the east, drawing on the best geographical knowledge available to European cartographers at the moment of its production. It was almost certainly made for the French royal court, and it represented a specific snapshot of what educated Europeans understood about the shape of the world in the generation before the great age of Portuguese exploration would begin transforming that understanding entirely. In the center of the African portion of the map, rendered with the same visual weight reserved elsewhere for the most significant rulers of Asia and Europe, sits a figure the accompanying text identifies as Musa Meli, Lord of the Guineas and of the gold mines of that region. He holds a golden orb. He carries a golden scepter. His crown is gold. The text describes him as so distinguished and noble a king that for the abundance of gold in his country, he is the richest and most noble king in all the land. Abraham Cresques was not inventing. He was synthesizing a tradition of geographical and commercial knowledge that had been accumulating in Mediterranean ports and trading houses for decades, fed by Arab merchants who moved the trans-Saharan routes, by travelers whose accounts circulated in Arabic across the Islamic world, and by the direct commercial contacts between North African traders and the merchants of Genoa, Venice, and the Catalan ports who purchased gold that arrived from the south. The Catalan Atlas was the most visually impressive expression of something that was already known across the commercial world. Europe knew about Mali. Europe knew about Mansa Musa. And Europe knew, with the practical certainty of people whose economies depended on the fact that a significant share of the gold-sustaining medieval European commerce came from a sophisticated empire in West Africa, governed by a king of extraordinary wealth. The image that Cresques produced posed a question that a generation of European rulers and merchants found both obvious and urgent. The gold came from this king, in this place. It reached Europe through Arab intermediaries, who moved it across the Sahara and sold it to North African merchants who sold it to European buyers. Each link in that chain extracted profit. Each intermediary reduced what was available to the European end of the transaction. What would be possible if a European power could find a route to the source directly? That question, asked in the generation after the Catalan Atlas circulated, became one of the organizing purposes behind Portuguese exploration along the African coast through the 15th century. Prince Henry of Portugal, known to later historians as Henry the Navigator, established a systematic program of coastal exploration beginning in the 1420s. His motivations included religious ambitions and genuine geographical curiosity. But the commercial logic was always present. The Portuguese were looking for a way around the Arab intermediaries who controlled the trans-Saharan gold trade. The Catalan Atlas had shown them where the gold was. The question was how to reach it. They eventually succeeded, though not in the form they initially imagined. The sea route around Africa to Asia, completed by Vasco da Gama in 1498, transformed global trade in ways that no one involved in the Catalan Atlas's production could have fully anticipated. And the direct coastal trade in West African gold that the Portuguese established along the Guinea coast from the 1470s onward began redirecting commercial traffic away from the trans-Saharan routes that had sustained Mali and Timbuktu for centuries. Not immediately, and not completely, but with a persistence that compounded over decades. The Catalan Atlas was not simply a document that recorded European knowledge of Mali. It was a document that helped motivate the exploration that would gradually shift the economic foundations that Mali depended on. The visibility that Mansa Musa achieved for his empire contributed indirectly to the chain of events that moved the gold trade from Saharan routes to the Atlantic coast. This is not a story with a deliberate villain. The Portuguese explorers were pursuing their own interests with the tools available to them. But consequences do not require intention to be real. The Catalan Atlas itself became a document that Europe would remember, copy, and reinterpret in different forms across the following century. As cartographers updated their understanding of the African continent, and as the Portuguese explorations brought new information back to the ports and printing houses of Europe, the portrait of Musa on his golden throne did not disappear from European geographical imagination immediately. It faded, slowly, as the information that replaced it served purposes different from acknowledging the wealth and sophistication of a West African king. That fading, and the specific mechanism by which it happened, is one of the most consequential intellectual processes of the past 6 centuries. Understanding it requires stepping back from the maps and asking a harder question. Europe had this knowledge. A cartographer in 1375 knew that West Africa was governed by sophisticated and wealthy rulers. Something happened to that knowledge in the centuries that followed. Something made it less visible, less central, less present in the mainstream understanding of the world's history. What happened, and why, is where we go in a later chapter. For now, hold the image of Musa at the center of the Catalan Atlas and carry it forward as a question. The knowledge was there, and something happened to it. Chapter 7. How an Empire is Governed. The System Inside the Gold. Somewhere in the Mali Empire, in the year 1350, a dispute has arisen between 2 merchants over a transaction involving gold dust. One merchant claims the weights used in the exchange were inaccurate. The other maintains the transaction was conducted correctly. In many medieval societies, a dispute of this kind would be resolved by whoever had more power, more connections, or more willingness to use force. In the Mali Empire, it was resolved by a court. This detail, drawn from the texture of Ibn Battuta's 1352 account rather than from a single documented case, captures something essential about what the Mali Empire actually was beneath the spectacular surface of gold and ceremony. Not simply a military machine that happened to sit on valuable resources, a functioning state with legal institutions, administrative procedures, and the kind of predictability in dispute resolution that commerce requires to operate at scale. Ibn Battuta arrived in Mali during the reign of Mansa Musa's brother, who ruled from approximately 1341 to 1360. His account is therefore an account of the empire in its second generation of greatness. Still powerful and still organized, already navigating the succession pressures that would eventually fragment it. He was a man who had seen the administrative systems of Morocco, Egypt, Persia, India, and China, and could assess what he found in Mali against genuine comparative experience. His judgment that Mali's governance was worth sustained attention was not the judgment of a man with limited reference points. Start with what he found most worth recording, because the selection tells you what actually distinguished Mali from the other sophisticated societies he had observed. He noted, with an emphasis suggesting it was not universal in his experience, that persons and property were secure throughout the empire's territory in a way that allowed a traveler to move with valuables without reasonable fear of robbery. He noted consistent weights and measures across the empire's markets. He noted that legal disputes had established channels of resolution that did not simply favor whoever had the most power. These are not the observations of a man describing a primitive society that happened to have gold. They are the observations of a man recognizing a mature administrative state, recording the specific ways it had solved problems that other states he had visited had not. The institutional structure producing these outcomes was built on several layers of governance operating simultaneously. At the center was the Mansa, whose authority combined political, military, and spiritual dimensions in ways that medieval kingship typically did, but with a specific character shaped by the pre-Islamic tradition of Mandinka sacred kingship, synthesized with Islamic concepts of legitimate rule. The Mansa was surrounded by elaborate court protocol that Ibn Battuta described in careful detail. Visitors approached in a posture of submission. Direct address to the king was mediated through intermediaries, who relayed words in both directions. Every interaction was a performance of hierarchical distance between the king and everyone else. This elaboration was governance technology rather than vanity. An empire whose territory extended hundreds of miles in every direction could not be governed by the personal supervision of a single ruler. The aura of the Mansa's authority had to be powerful enough to maintain compliance among provincial governors who might go months without direct contact with the center. The more overwhelming the performance of that authority in the moments when it was visible, the more effectively it operated in the long intervals when it was not. Below the Mansa, provincial governors were responsible for maintaining order, collecting tribute, and providing military support when required. Some were members of the Mandinka nobility appointed by the central government. Others were local rulers who had submitted to Mali's authority and been confirmed in their positions in exchange for tribute and military obligation. This distinction mattered enormously for how the empire actually functioned. Governors appointed from the center were loyal to the Mansa by institutional design, though individual loyalty varied as it always does in human institutions. Local rulers confirmed in their positions had their own power bases and their own interests, and their loyalty to the central authority was contingent on the central authority remaining strong enough to make defiance more costly than cooperation. This was not a flaw in the design. It was a feature, carefully managed. The structure that gave local rulers a stake in the commercial peace also required the center to maintain the conditions that made the arrangement worth accepting. It created a discipline on the central government, a requirement that Mali's rulers actually deliver the security and commercial access, justifying the tribute flowing to the capital. Rulers who delivered this reliably maintained a stable empire. Rulers who did not would discover, as Mali's later kings discovered, that the local rulers at the periphery were very quick to reassert independence. They had never fully surrendered. The legal system operating across the empire drew on both Islamic law and existing Mandinka customary law, a synthesis that Ibn Battuta observed in operation and found more orderly than he had expected. Islamic courts handled disputes among Muslim residents, who, by the 14th century, included most of the merchant and scholarly class across the empire's major cities. Customary law handled disputes in rural areas and among non-Muslim populations, administered by local authorities, according to traditions that predated the empire's founding. The synthesis was not seamless. Tensions between the two legal traditions appear in the sources at various points, particularly around questions of inheritance and the status of women, where Mandinka customary practice diverged significantly from Islamic legal norms and where the society chose to maintain its own traditions. Ibn Battuta found this troubling and said so. His disapproval should be read for what it is: the reaction of a man applying 14th century North African Islamic orthodoxy to a society that had made different choices, rather than as an objective judgment that the society had failed at something it was trying to achieve. Mali was not trying to become North Africa. It was trying to govern millions of people across an enormous territory, maintain a commercial network of extraordinary complexity, and synthesize a new religious tradition with an existing cultural framework. On those terms, Ibn Battuta's account taken as a whole describes a state doing those things with considerable success. The financial administration at the heart of the system rested ultimately on the reliable flow of tribute and commercial revenue from the empire's vast network of provinces and trading partners. The officials responsible for managing that flow were, by all available evidence, a professional class whose competence and relative honesty were institutional requirements rather than personal virtues. An empire whose revenues depended on the integrity of its weighing officials could not afford to staff those positions with the corrupt and the incompetent. It selected for the capable, and it maintained the credibility of its commercial standards through enforcement that Ibn Battuta's observations suggest was real rather than merely nominal. What this picture of Mali's governance adds up to is a state that understood itself and its own requirements with considerable clarity. Not a perfect state, not a just state by any universal standard that transcends its own time and context, but a mature and self-aware political entity that had developed institutional responses to the specific challenges of governing a large, diverse, commercially complex empire in the specific geography of the Western Sudan. The institutional depth that Ibn Battuta observed was built over more than a century of deliberate construction. The pressures that would test it were already forming at the edges of the empire as he made his notes and prepared the long journey home. The empire was still holding. The courts were still functioning. The weights were still being checked. The gold was still moving north through the Sahara toward the markets of the Mediterranean world. And, in the royal court, the question of succession, always present in monarchical systems and never fully resolved by any of them, was beginning to generate pressures that would eventually find every crack in everything that had been built. Chapter 8. The Cracks in the Gold. Meet a man named Mansa Musa II. He inherited the Mali throne in approximately 1360. The grandson of Mansa Musa, born into one of the wealthiest empires of the medieval world. raised in a court of extraordinary sophistication, educated by scholars whose libraries held centuries of accumulated knowledge. He had every advantage that a ruler could inherit: the commercial networks, the administrative traditions, the military institutions, the diplomatic relationships that his predecessors had spent a century building with painstaking care. He spent his reign dismantling most of it. By the time Marijata II died in 1373, he had depleted the royal treasury through expenditures that the Arabic sources describe with consistent disapproval. He had alienated the provincial governors, whose cooperation was the operational foundation of the empire's structure. He had made military commitments that the empire's contracting resources could not sustain. The chronicles that document his reign use language that translates across the centuries with uncomfortable clarity. This was a ruler who consumed what he had inherited, without understanding how it had been built or what it would cost to lose. His story is the hinge point of Mali's history, the moment when the structural vulnerabilities that had always been present in the empire's design began to compound faster than capable governance could manage them. To understand why his failures mattered so much, you need to understand what had already been weakening before he took the throne. Mansa Musa died around 1337. His son Magan I succeeded him and ruled for approximately 4 years. During Magan's brief tenure, a Mossi raiding party reached Timbuktu and sacked it. Not a siege, not a conquest, a raid. The kind of incursion that a functioning imperial military should have deterred before it reached the empire's intellectual heart. That it did not. That Timbuktu was vulnerable to a raiding party at all said something about the gap between the empire Musa had governed and the empire his son had inherited. Musa's brother Suleiman succeeded around 1341 and ruled until 1360, the reign that Ibn Battuta observed and documented with genuine admiration. Suleiman was a more capable ruler than his nephew, and his 2 decades of governance stabilized the empire sufficiently that an outside observer could still describe it with respect. But Ibn Battuta's account, read carefully, shows a court already alive with internal competition, a political environment requiring constant management that had not been necessary under Musa's dominance. Then came Marijata II, and 13 years of accelerating deterioration. The structural problem his reign exposed had been built into the empire's design from the beginning. The political arrangement that made Mali commercially brilliant also made it institutionally fragile in a specific way. Its coherence depended on the center remaining strong enough to make the arrangement worth accepting for the provincial rulers who had never fully surrendered their own power bases. When the center weakened, those rulers had every structural incentive to reassert the independence they had been suspending, not out of disloyalty, but out of the rational calculation that an arrangement serving their interests only worked while the center could deliver its side of the bargain. Marijata II's reign demonstrated that the center could not be relied upon, and that demonstration, once made, could not be unmade by his successors. The rulers who followed attempted to recover what had been lost. Musa II and Magan II both had periods of partial success, reasserting central authority in specific territories and temporarily stabilizing specific fronts. But they were working against a compounding problem. Each period of weak governance taught another generation of provincial rulers that defiance was survivable. The lesson accumulating at the periphery, slowly and then with gathering certainty, was that the center was no longer reliable enough to organize a political life around. While Mali was working through this internal deterioration, a new power was rising to its east with the focused energy of people who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The Songhai people had occupied the territory around the Niger Bend for generations. Centered on the city of Gao, they had existed within Mali's sphere of influence at various points during the empire's peak. The weakening of Mali's central authority through the second half of the 14th century created the space for Songhai to reassert its independence. And the Songhai leadership moved into that space deliberately. The figure who transformed opportunity into empire was Sunni Ali, who came to power in Gao in approximately 1464. Picture him this way: a commander who understood that the Songhai nobles surrounding him were watching for any sign that his grip was loosening, so he never let it loosen. A ruler who rose before dawn to review his cavalry before the horses were watered, who dictated his orders before his generals had finished their morning meal, who moved through the Western Sudan with a military efficiency that the fragmented successor states of Mali could not match and could not stop. A man who had limited patience for the formal requirements of Islamic scholarship, who saw the scholars of Timbuktu as a political class with their own interests as much as a religious community deserving of deference, and who treated them accordingly with a directness they neither forgave nor forgot. Sunni Ali was a military commander of exceptional ability and exceptional ruthlessness, two qualities that the historical sources consistently acknowledge even when they disapprove of his methods, which the Muslim chroniclers frequently did. Those chronicles were written primarily by members of the scholarly class who experienced his rule as threatening and often hostile. Their accounts are primary sources of genuine value, and accounts shaped by the perspectives of people with personal stakes in how the story was told. In 1468, Sunni Ali captured Timbuktu from the Tuareg forces that had been controlling it. His treatment of the city's scholarly community was harsh. Some scholars fled. Others faced consequences that the chronicles describe in terms of genuine grief and genuine grievance. The intellectual life of Timbuktu was disrupted, though not destroyed. And the disruption was severe enough that scholars who had spent their lives building the city's libraries were suddenly calculating the cost of staying. In 1473, Sunni Ali captured Jenne, the other great commercial center of the Niger Bend, after a siege that the sources describe as lasting approximately 7 years. That duration tells you something about how seriously Jenne resisted and how determined Songhai was to persist. With both Jenne and Timbuktu under Songhai control, the commercial heart of the Western Sudan had shifted eastward, away from Mali and toward a new center of gravity. The Mali Empire did not end with a single collapse. It contracted, slowly and then with gathering speed, losing territory and commercial access and political authority over the course of several decades until what remained was a much smaller state in the western portion of the original empire's territory, centered on the Mandinka heartland where Sundiata had begun. That remnant survived in various forms into the 17th century, maintaining the institutional forms and the cultural identity, while the substance that had made those forms significant had largely passed to other hands. Something is worth pausing on here that the standard historical narrative tends to present as simple failure, but that deserves more careful consideration. The Mali Empire lasted, at its full extent, for roughly 2 centuries. It governed a population of millions across an enormous territory. It maintained commercial networks connecting sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean world. It built universities and libraries. It produced scholars whose work is still being translated. It established a tradition of governance sophisticated enough that the most widely traveled observer of the 14th century found it worthy of sustained attention and genuine respect. 2 centuries of organized, commercially productive, Intellectually active civilization is not a failure by any standard applied consistently across world history. The question worth asking about Mali's decline is not why it eventually ended, because everything eventually ends, but what the specific character of its decline reveals about the choices made during its rise. The political structure that enabled Mali's commercial brilliance also limited its institutional resilience when the center weakened. The reliance on the Mansa's personal authority to hold the arrangement together meant the empire was only as stable as its current ruler. These were trade-offs, not mistakes. Every state makes trade-offs. The interesting question is whether the people making them understood what they were exchanging. And the evidence suggests that the most capable Mali rulers did understand their system well enough to manage its vulnerabilities deliberately. It was when that deliberate management gave way to incompetence, and then to the sustained damage of succession warfare, that the vulnerabilities became irreversible. What Mali passed to its successors was not simply territory and trade routes. It was a tradition, a way of understanding the relationship between commercial organization and political authority, a scholarly culture centered on Timbuktu that would survive the political transition from Mali to Songhai and continue producing knowledge for another century. A cultural identity built around the Mandinka language and traditions that persists in some 20 million speakers and their descendants. To this day, empires on. Traditions are harder to kill. The Songhai Empire that rose from Mali's decline would discover this in its own way. When an army arrived from the north, carrying weapons, the Western Sudan had not yet encountered an organized military application, and that would end Songhai's dominance in a single afternoon on the banks of the Niger River. Chapter 9. Timbuktu Falls. The day the books almost died. Ahmad Baba al-Timbuktu was 52 years old when the soldiers came for him. He had spent his entire adult life in Timbuktu. He had studied at Sankore under scholars who had trained under the scholars who had built the institution into one of the significant centers of Islamic learning in the world. He had produced, by the time of his arrest, at least 40 major written works covering Islamic law, theology, and biography, works of sufficient quality that his reputation extended to Cairo and Fez and the other major centers of Islamic scholarship in the medieval world. He had a private library of more than 1,600 volumes, one of the largest personal collections in a city, famous for its libraries. In 1593, 2 years after an army from Morocco had crossed the Sahara and shattered the Songhai successor state in a single engagement, Saadian soldiers arrived at his door. He was arrested, loaded onto a camel, and transported across the Sahara to Marrakesh, a journey of roughly 1,200 miles through terrain that had already killed a significant portion of the army that had made it in the opposite direction 2 years earlier. He arrived in Marrakesh having lost his library, his home, and his freedom. He was placed under a form of house arrest in a city that was, in a technical sense, the capital of the government responsible for his situation. He would remain there for more than a decade. To understand how Ahmad Baba ended up on that camel, go back to the morning of March 13th, 1591, and a decision made in Marrakesh by a ruler named Ahmad al-Mansur. Al-Mansur was the Sultan of the Saadian dynasty of Morocco, a state that had accumulated significant wealth and military power in the late 16th century, including access to firearms that had been transforming warfare in the Mediterranean world for generations, but had not yet been deployed in organized military operations in the Western Sudan. He looked south across the Sahara at the Niger Bend cities. at the gold trade that had made Mali wealthy and that still generated substantial commerce under the successor arrangements that followed Songhai's rise. And he made a calculation. If he could establish control over those trade routes, the wealth flowing through them would flow to Marrakesh instead. The military obstacle was the Songhai successor state still controlling the Niger Bend. Al-Mansur's advisors warned him that sending an army across the Sahara was extremely dangerous. The desert crossing alone had defeated previous military ventures. The Songhai military was substantial in numbers. The supply lines would be extended beyond anything previous campaigns had attempted. Al-Mansur listened to the warnings and sent the army anyway. A force that various sources describe differently, with most accounts suggesting several thousand soldiers, left Marrakesh under the command of a general named Judar Pasha, crossing the Sahara over roughly 5 months at enormous human cost. Soldiers died from thirst, from exhaustion, from the specific miseries of a desert crossing in military formation. The force that arrived at the Niger River in March of 1591 was significantly smaller than the force that had departed. It was, nonetheless, sufficient because of the arquebuses and cannon it carried. At the Battle of Tondibi, fought near Gao on March 13, 1591, the Songhai force that met Judar Pasha's army was numerically overwhelming. Contemporary sources suggest the Songhai fielded tens of thousands of warriors, cavalry that had been the dominant military force in the region for generations, and a numerical advantage that by any conventional assessment should have been decisive. The battle was not decided by numbers. The arquebus volleys and cannon fire disrupted the Songhai formations before they could close to effective range for their own weapons. Cavalry that would have been decisive against any opponent the region had previously faced found itself without effective responses to an enemy that could kill at distances that the tactical traditions of the Western Sudan had not yet developed consistent answers for. The Songhai army broke. Gao fell within days. Timbuktu fell shortly afterward. In April of 1591, in an atmosphere that the sources describe as a city paralyzed by the speed and completeness of what had just happened. The military power that had organized the Western Sudan for a century was gone. The scholarly community of a city that had flourished for 2 centuries under the protection of powerful empires was now under the administration of an occupying force whose relationship to Islamic learning was, at best, ambivalent. The deterioration of that relationship into open conflict took 2 years. The scholars of Timbuktu were not simply academics in the modern sense of people whose activities are confined to libraries and lecture rooms. They were the most influential members of their society. Men whose legal opinions shaped commercial transactions, whose religious authority gave weight to political decisions, and whose networks of students and former students extended across the entire region. Any occupying force attempting to establish stable administration had to reckon with them. Al-Mansur's administration in the Niger Bend reckoned with them badly. The specific incident triggering the arrest of Ahmad Baba and his colleagues in 1593 is described in the sources in ways that reflect the perspectives of people recording them, making precise reconstruction difficult. What is clear is that the Saadian administration concluded the scholarly community represented a focus for resistance, and that removing its most prominent members from Timbuktu would reduce the organizational capacity of any opposition. They were not wrong about the scholars' influence. They were wrong about what removing them would accomplish. Ahmad Baba in Marrakesh continued to teach. His reputation was substantial enough that even the Moroccan scholarly community, which was in theory aligned with the government responsible for his exile, sought his instruction and his opinions. He produced written works during his years of house arrest that the Moroccan scholarly tradition absorbed and preserved. He was eventually permitted to return to Timbuktu in 1607, where he spent his remaining years attempting to reconstruct what had been dispersed, writing with a controlled clarity about what had been lost that is still palpable 4 centuries later. But the larger consequence of the Saadian invasion was not what happened to Ahmad Baba. It was what happened to the books. The scholars who were not arrested faced a calculation that their predecessors had never needed to make, and that their descendants would face again 4 centuries later. The manuscripts in the city's libraries, centuries of accumulated scholarship representing an irreplaceable archive of West African and Islamic intellectual history, were in obvious danger from a force that had already demonstrated its willingness to arrest scholars and transport them across the Sahara. The response was organized, deliberate, and rooted in an institutional instinct that the families of Timbuktu would pass down across generations. Manuscripts were wrapped in cloth and animal skins. They were placed in wooden chests. They were buried in the floors of houses, hidden in wells, carried into the surrounding desert on camelback, and deposited in locations known only to the families responsible for their protection. This was not panic. It was a commitment made across generations. A declaration that these books were worth protecting at personal cost across whatever period of danger lay ahead. The families making that commitment had no way of knowing how long that period would be. They committed anyway. The Saadian administration of the Niger Bend lasted for several decades, but never achieved the commercial dominance that al-Mansur had envisioned. The gold trade that had motivated the invasion proved more difficult to control than he had anticipated. The local populations who actually moved the gold were not easily redirected toward Marrakesh by military force. The gold did not flow north in the quantities promised to the soldiers who had crossed the desert. What the invasion did accomplish was the permanent disruption of the political and commercial structures that had sustained Timbuktu as a center of scholarship. The Songhai Empire, that had been the city's primary patron and protector for a century, was shattered and never recovered. The successor arrangements that emerged were smaller, poorer, and less capable of providing the sustained patronage that a major scholarly institution requires. The combination of political disruption, commercial disruption, and the departure or imprisonment of the scholarly community's most distinguished members created conditions from which Timbuktu's golden age of scholarship could not recover. The intellectual life of the city resumed, in diminished form. Over the following decades and centuries, scholars returned, new manuscripts were produced. The families who had hidden their collections maintained them with the same care that had characterized the hiding. But the specific combination of wealth, patronage, and scholarly density that had made Timbuktu one of the significant intellectual centers of the medieval world was not reassembled. The peak had passed. The manuscripts were still there, protected in private collections across the city and the surrounding region, waiting for conditions that would allow them to emerge. Those conditions would not fully arrive for 4 centuries. And when they did, they would arrive in the company of a new and different kind of danger that no one in 1591 could have imagined. Chapter 10. The Erasure. How History is Written by Winners. In the spring of 1828, a French explorer named René Cailly became the first European to reach Timbuktu and return alive to describe it. He was 27 years old. He had traveled in disguise, presenting himself as an Egyptian Muslim to avoid the hostility that a European Christian would have faced on the journey. He had survived illness, exhaustion, and months of travel through terrain that had defeated previous European attempts. When he finally arrived, he looked at what was in front of him and wrote in his journal that he had expected something different. The great city of legend, the city of gold that European geographical literature had been constructing from fragments of the Catalan Atlas and travelers' accounts for centuries, was a city of mud brick buildings and modest commerce, still inhabited, still functioning as a regional trading center, but a considerable distance from the mythological place his imagination had furnished. He was disappointed in the way that people are disappointed when reality declines to match the scale of the story told about it. What Cayley did not know was that the most significant contents of the city he was walking through were hidden. The manuscripts representing centuries of scholarship were in private family collections, in underground rooms, in wrapped bundles beneath the floors of houses that looked from the outside like ordinary structures in an ordinary Saharan city. The evidence of Timbuktu's intellectual greatness was all around him. It was simply not visible to someone who did not know where to look and who had not been given reason to trust. His disappointment, published in his account of the journey, contributed to the European narrative that Timbuktu was a myth whose reality could not support the legend. He was not lying. He was describing what he saw. But what he saw was a city several centuries past its peak, still carrying its history in hidden form, in the hands of families who had excellent reasons to be careful about what they showed to European strangers. The gap between what Cayley saw and what was actually there is the gap this chapter is about. The intellectual foundation of the erasure was laid not by explorers but by philosophers. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, in his lectures on the philosophy of history delivered in the 1820s, described Africa as existing outside of history proper. Africa south of the Sahara, he argued, had produced no historical development in the sense that mattered to his framework, no progress of the rational spirit through time, no movement toward the self-consciousness that, in his system, was the destination of human civilization. It was, in his description, a land of childhood, a continent of nature rather than culture. These lectures were not a marginal text. They were among the most widely read and most institutionally influential works of philosophy produced in the 19th century. They shaped the intellectual framework within which subsequent European scholars approached questions of history, civilization, and development. Scholars who had never read Hegel directly absorbed his framework through the institutions his framework had shaped, in the same way that people absorb the assumptions of the society around them without being aware of absorbing them. As scholars, including Valentin Mudimbe, have documented in careful detail, Hegel had access to the Arabic geographical literature that described the Ghana and Mali empires. The argument that Africa had no history was not the conclusion of someone who had examined the available evidence and found it insufficient. It was a philosophical position constructed in advance of the evidence and maintained despite the evidence, because it served a larger theoretical framework that Hegel was committed to for reasons that had nothing to do with West African history specifically. The colonial enterprise that European powers conducted across Africa through the 19th century created institutional incentives to sustain and elaborate this position. A colonialism presenting itself as bringing civilization to people who had none required, as its logical foundation, that the people being colonized had genuinely produced nothing that deserved the name. The historical record of Mali, of Timbuktu's universities, of the trans-Saharan commercial networks, was not compatible with that foundational claim, and so it was systematically undervalued in ways that shaped what European scholars chose to study, what got published, what got translated, and what got taught. This was not a conspiracy with a planning committee. It was the emergent result of an intellectual environment that rewarded certain kinds of scholarship and made other kinds professionally costly. Individual scholars operating within that environment made choices shaped by it, choices that felt like normal professional judgment. The cumulative effect of those individual choices across generations of scholars and institutions was the systematic exclusion of African historical achievement from the mainstream narrative of world history. Historians of education have argued that the textbook selection process in American educational systems reinforced this exclusion through a separate mechanism. The committees that approved history textbooks for use in American public schools were composed of people whose own education had been formed by the frameworks described above. They were not, in most cases, equipped to recognize the absences in those frameworks as absences rather than as the natural shape of historical knowledge. The economics of textbook publishing, which favored incremental revision over structural reconception, meant that the exclusion of Mali tended to reproduce itself with each new edition, creating a cycle that individual teachers and scholars found very difficult to interrupt from within. The UNESCO General History of Africa project, which produced 8 volumes of scholarship between 1981 and 1993, was the most comprehensive attempt to challenge this exclusion from within the academy. It brought together African and non-African scholars to produce a historical account of the continent drawing on Arabic texts, oral traditions, and archaeological evidence. Its impact on mainstream Western historical education has been, to be direct about it, limited, because it was published in academic formats that reach specialists rather than general audiences. The viral spread of information about Mansa Musa's wealth beginning in the 2010s reached audiences that no academic publication had ever reached. The $400 billion figure, methodologically problematic as it is, introduced the name Mansa Musa to people who had never encountered it in any educational context, and the introduction generated genuine curiosity about a civilization that most of them had not been taught existed. The curiosity is real, even if the figure that sparked it is imprecise, and it is that curiosity this documentary has been attempting to serve, not by replacing the viral simplification with a more sophisticated simplification, but by providing the fuller picture that the curiosity deserves. Renee Cayley walked through a city whose most important contents were hidden and saw nothing remarkable. The generation now encountering Mansa Musa through a social media infographic is, in many cases, looking harder. What they find, when they look past the viral figure toward the actual history, is a civilization the evidence has always been there to document. The knowledge was always there. The question has always been whether enough people were paying attention to find it. Chapter 11. What Survived? The Living Legacy. On a night in 2012, in a city under armed occupation, a man named Abdelkader Haidara was loading manuscripts into metal trunks. The trunks were ordinary, the kind used for shipping goods across West Africa. Nothing that would attract attention from the armed patrols moving through the streets outside. The manuscripts inside them were not ordinary. Some were 500 years old. Some were older. They had been written by scholars who had studied at Sankore, copied by students who would go on to teach students of their own, collected by families who understood that the books in their care were worth protecting at personal cost across whatever period of danger lay ahead. Haidara was the head of the Mama Haidara Commemorative Library, one of roughly 60 private manuscript libraries in Timbuktu. The inheritor of a tradition of book protection that his family traced back to the Saadian invasion of 1591, he had spent decades working to bring the manuscripts under his family's stewardship into a condition where they could be properly conserved, catalogued, and eventually made accessible to scholars. International donors had supported the work. Progress had been slow but real. Then, in early 2012, armed groups moved into northern Mali following a political crisis in the south. Timbuktu came under the control of an organization that had demonstrated in other contexts its willingness to destroy cultural heritage it considered un-Islamic. The calculation Haidara faced was not complicated. The manuscripts were in danger. They needed to move. What followed was one of the most significant cultural rescue operations in modern history, conducted almost entirely in secret by ordinary people, under conditions where discovery could have meant death. Haidara organized a network of couriers, negotiators, drivers, and boat operators to move an estimated 350,000 manuscripts out of Timbuktu and south to the capital Bamako, hundreds of miles away. The operation used riverboats on the Niger, vehicles on the roads south, donkeys on paths where vehicles could not go, and in some cases human porters carrying chests through the desert at night. It happened over roughly a year, from 2012 through early 2013, conducted with the specific care of people who had a precise understanding of what they were moving and why it mattered. The manuscripts traveled in metal trunks and wooden chests and wrapped bundles, protected against moisture and heat, moved in stages through a network of trusted contacts who understood what they were handling. The families who had been responsible for specific collections for generations insisted on accompanying their manuscripts in many cases, maintaining the physical continuity of custody that had been unbroken since 1591. When French military forces intervened in Mali in January of 2013 and began pushing the armed groups back from Timbuktu, they arrived to find that the most irreplaceable contents of the city's libraries were already gone. The buildings were still there. Some cultural heritage had been damaged or destroyed by the occupying forces. But the manuscripts, the physical embodiment of what Timbuktu had produced over 5 centuries of scholarship, had been moved to safety before the armies arrived. The operation cost millions of dollars, funded through a combination of Haidara's international donor network and the personal resources of the families involved. Joshua Hammer, who documented the story in his 2016 book, described it as among the most remarkable acts of cultural preservation in recent memory. That assessment holds up on examination. The manuscripts are in Bamako now. They are housed in conditions better than what Timbuktu currently provides, though still not ideal for the most fragile items. The work of cataloging, conserving, and digitizing them continues at a pace that the people doing it consistently describe as slower than the physical deterioration of some items allows. The scholars who have worked with portions of the collection have been finding exactly what the tradition of Timbuktu scholarship suggested they would find. An astronomical manuscript from the 15th century containing calculations demonstrating engagement with the same scholarly tradition that observers in Cairo and Baghdad were working within, reflecting the specific astronomical conditions of West Africa's geographic position in ways that mark it as original work rather than derivative copying. Legal responsa, documenting the sophisticated intellectual labor of applying Islamic law to the specific social conditions of West African society. Mathematical texts, historical chronicles, botanical catalogs, and correspondence between Timbuktu scholars and colleagues in Fez and Cairo, documenting the city's integration into the broader intellectual networks of the medieval Islamic world. Each text rewrites, in a small way, the standard assessment of what was intellectually possible in West Africa across 5 centuries. Each translation brings the civilization that produced it a step closer to the visibility it has always deserved. The manuscripts are the most concentrated expression of what survived the Mali Empire's political end. But they are not the only thing that survived. The Mande language family, which includes Mandinka, Bambara, Soninke, and related languages descended from the linguistic tradition that Sundiata's Mali carried across the western Sudan, is spoken today by an estimated 20 million people across West Africa, from Senegal and Gambia in the west, through Mali and Burkina Faso and Guinea in the east and south. These are living languages of commerce, family life, and cultural identity, carrying within their structures the accumulated history of a civilization that predates the European colonial period by centuries. The griot tradition that preserves Sundiata's story has adapted rather than disappeared. Contemporary griots perform at weddings, political events, and cultural celebrations across West Africa, maintaining the function of historical memory and social commentary that the tradition has always served, while incorporating the influences of the modern world into a form that remains recognizably continuous with what the griots of Sundiata's court practiced. The kora, a 21-string instrument that is among the most direct musical descendants of the Mali Empire's court tradition, has found audiences across the world through the recordings of musicians like the late Toumani Diabaté, who died in 2023, demonstrating that the aesthetic tradition of Mali could communicate across distances of 5 centuries with its essential character intact. The architecture of Timbuktu, the mud brick mosques that Abu Ishaq al-Sahili designed in the 14th century and that subsequent generations maintained and extended, still stands. The Jingar Bur Mosque, the Sankor Mosque, and the Sidi Yahya Mosque are UNESCO World Heritage Sites, though their physical condition has been threatened by Saharan dust storms and by damage inflicted during the 2012 occupation. Restoration work funded by international partners has preserved much of what remained after 2013, though the resources available are consistently insufficient to the scale of the need. The food crops that West African agricultural systems developed and the Mali Empire's commercial networks helped distribute remain essential food crops across large parts of Africa and beyond. Sorghum, millet, and varieties of rice refined through centuries of savanna farming sustain communities across the continent. Agricultural knowledge of this kind, encoding understanding of which plants thrive, in which conditions, and how to maintain soil productivity across multiple growing seasons, is a form of intellectual heritage that requires no manuscripts to preserve because it is encoded in the seeds themselves. The legacy of Mali is not a museum exhibit waiting for visitors. It is a living inheritance, carried in languages spoken by 20 million people, in musical traditions performed on stages from Bamako to Berlin, in agricultural practices sustaining communities across West Africa, in manuscripts being slowly and carefully brought back into legibility by scholars who understand what they are working with. The chain of custody that Haidara maintained through the night of 2012, loading manuscripts into metal trunks in the streets of an occupied city, is the same chain that stretches back through the families who hid books from the Sadian army in 1591, through the scholars who wrote those books at Sankor in the 14th and 15th centuries, through the rulers who built the institutions that made Sankor possible, back to a man who stood up from the ground with the help of an iron rod and built a coalition out of shared interest rather than shared fear. The chain held. It is holding now. Chapter 12. Mansa, Musa, and the Mirror. In the summer of 2012, a website published an article estimating Mansa Musa's wealth at $400 billion. The article offered no primary sources. It did not explain its methodology. It did not engage with the economic historians who had spent careers thinking carefully about medieval West African wealth. It was the kind of content that aggregator websites produce to generate traffic. A list of historical figures with modern dollar equivalents attached to their names. It went viral. It went viral again the following year. It has been going viral, in one form or another, for more than a decade. This documentary has been careful throughout to explain why that figure is methodologically problematic, why applying modern purchasing power calculations to medieval economic conditions produces numbers that are more spectacular than analytically useful, and why serious economic historians engage with Musa's wealth in more qualified terms. That caution is warranted, and this documentary stands behind it. The caution does not mean the viral phenomenon is without significance. It means the significance is different from what the surface content suggests. Consider what the $400 billion figure actually does when it lands in the mind of someone who has spent their entire education absorbing a picture of world history organized around European and Mediterranean civilizations. It does not educate them about medieval economics. It does something more disruptive and more useful. It forces a recalibration of the mental map. Most people who encounter that figure carry a prior understanding of history in which the great concentrations of wealth, the great centers of power, and the significant civilizations are located in Europe, in the ancient Mediterranean world, and in the river valley civilizations of Asia. That understanding is not invented. It reflects real historical achievements, but it is also incomplete in ways that most people who hold it have never been given reason to question, because their education did not provide the information that would have prompted the question. The Mansa Musa figure disrupts the map. It places one of the world's greatest concentrations of wealth at a specific and not particularly distant moment in history, in a place that the standard historical narrative had assigned to the margins. The disruption is the real content, not the specific dollar figure. The underlying historical reality that the figure points toward, that the Mali Empire was genuinely among the most commercially significant and financially substantial political entities of the medieval world, is not in dispute among historians who have seriously examined the evidence. The gap between what the standard curriculum taught and what the viral content reveals is a wound that keeps reopening because it has never been honestly addressed by the institutions responsible for addressing it. There's a personal dimension to what this story asks of its audience, one more immediate than any geopolitical argument. The story of how the Mali Empire was erased from mainstream historical consciousness is not a story about a distant past. The textbooks that omit it are still in use. The curriculum frameworks that exclude it are still being applied. The institutional inertia that perpetuated the erasure for 2 centuries has not been overcome by a decade of viral content. However much that content has changed individual awareness, what an honest education looks like, one that accounts for the full scope of human achievement across all the civilizations that have contributed to the world we inhabit, is a question that educational systems in the United States and Europe have been arguing about for decades without reaching a stable answer. That argument is not simply academic. It is about whose past gets treated as universal heritage and whose gets treated as specialized interest. It is about who gets to feel that the story of human achievement includes their ancestors. And it is about what kind of world we are building when we decide those questions one way or another. Mansa Musa did not set out to become a mirror for 21st century arguments about historical education. He set out to fulfill a religious obligation and, in the manner of rulers who understand that everything they do is also a political statement, to demonstrate to the entire Islamic world what the Mali Empire was capable of producing. He succeeded at both, more thoroughly than he could have known. The cartographers of Europe drew his portrait. The merchants of Cairo felt his passage for a generation. And 5 centuries later, a viral infographic introduced his name to audiences he could not have imagined, in places he had never heard of, as part of an argument about whose history counts and whose has been hidden. The argument is not finished. The manuscripts of Timbuktu are still largely untranslated. The full scope of what West African civilization produced and preserved is still waiting for the sustained scholarly and popular attention it deserves. But the direction of travel has changed, and the generation that encountered Mansa Musa through a number on a screen is, in many cases, asking for the fuller story that the number could not tell. This documentary has been one attempt to tell it. Chapter 13. Epilogue. The Manuscripts in the Sand. Abdelkader Haidara does not describe the completion of the manuscript removal operation as a triumph. He describes it as relief. The specific relief of someone who has been carrying a responsibility for a very long time, across conditions that made carrying it continuously dangerous, and who has, for the moment, set it down without catastrophic failure. Not victory, not celebration. The quiet that comes after sustained vigilance finally releases its grip. By early 2013, when French military intervention had pushed the armed groups back from Timbuktu and the immediate danger had passed, the accounting of what had been moved, what had survived, and what had been lost was still ongoing. 350,000 manuscripts transported to Bamako, some damaged in transit, some affected by the conditions of hiding and movement, a small number unaccounted for, either destroyed before the removal could reach them or lost in the necessary chaos of an operation conducted under urgent and dangerous circumstances. But most had survived, the thing that the families of Timbuktu had been protecting since 1591, through the Saadian occupation and the political fragmentation of the Western Sudan, and the imposition of French colonial administration, and the uncertainties of post-independence Mali, and finally, the armed occupation of 2012, had survived again. The manuscripts are in Bamako now. They are not where they belong, which is in Timbuktu, in the city and the culture that produced them. The security situation in northern Mali has not stabilized sufficiently to make their return safe. The scholarly infrastructure needed to make that return meaningful, the conservation facilities, the trained researchers, the institutional support for sustained work, does not yet exist at the required scale. The digitization work continues. Scholars working with portions of the collection are finding exactly what the tradition always suggested they would find: an astronomical text from the 15th century, containing calculations demonstrating engagement with the same scholarly tradition that observers in Cairo and Baghdad were working within, reflecting the specific conditions of West Africa's geographic position in ways that mark it as original work rather than imitation. A legal compilation documenting the sophisticated intellectual labor of applying a body of law developed in one context to the specific social conditions of a different society. Doing the hard work of synthesis that serious legal scholarship requires. A mathematical text, a botanical catalog, a chronicle of the Songhai kings, written by a scholar who watched the events it describes unfold from within the city those events were destroying. Each text is a window into a world that the standard historical narrative had declared did not exist in any meaningful form. Each one requires revision, small but accumulating, of the picture of medieval intellectual life that the inherited frameworks had furnished. There is a specific moment from Haidara's account of the 2012 operation that stays with you. When his network was loading the manuscripts into the metal trunks, some of the older members of the families who had been protecting specific collections for generations refused to leave their books without accompanying them. They insisted on being present for the loading, on traveling with the trunks to Bamako, on maintaining the physical continuity of custody that their families had kept unbroken since the Saadian invasion. These were not scholars in the professional academic sense. They could not necessarily read everything in the collections they had spent their lives protecting. They were custodians, people who had inherited a responsibility rather than a specialty, who understood themselves as links in a chain, obligated to pass on what they had received in the same condition they had received it, to people who would come after them and would know what to do with it. That chain is what this documentary has been about. It begins with a man named Sundiata Keita, who stood up from the ground, built a coalition out of shared interest rather than shared fear, and founded a tradition whose memory would outlast him by 8 centuries and counting. It continues with a man named Mansa Musa, who crossed the Sahara with enough wealth to reshape the medieval economy, brought home an architect who changed the face of his cities, and sat for a portrait on a cartographer's map that Europe would remember, copy, and reinterpret in different forms for a century to come. It runs through scholars whose names most of the world has never learned, who filled the libraries of a city that English speakers would one day use as a joke about remoteness, writing texts of genuine sophistication that are only now being fully read. It passes through families whose names appear in no history book anyone was assigned in school, who wrapped those texts in animal skins and buried them in desert floors and carried them across rivers in the dark. And it reaches a man named Abdelkader Haidara, who loaded the same books into metal trunks in the occupied streets of a city his ancestors had protected for 5 centuries, because he understood that the chain of custody he had inherited was not his to break. The books survived. The knowledge is there. The only question left is whether we are paying attention.